Thank you all for joining us for the California Fire Science Seminar Series. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Autumn Schaefer. I am one of the statewide coordinators for the California Fire Science Consortium, and I will be your host for today. The California Fire Science Seminar Series is organized and supported by the California Fire Science Consortium, the Fire Research Group, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, Merced. The student committee was also integral to the success of this seminar series, which included 18 students and postdocs from across the nation who helped us select speakers and topics for the series. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the California Fire Science Consortium website and YouTube channel. Following today's presentation, there will be a Q&A session. Please feel free to add any questions you have to the Q&A chat throughout the presentation. Today's seminar, titled The Realignment of Federal Environmental Policies to Recognize Fire's Role, will be presented by Sarah A. Clark and Jenna Archer. Jenna Archer is an attorney and Sarah Clark is a partner, both working at Shute, Mahoney, and Weinberger LLP, a public interest law firm based in San Francisco, California. Sarah Clark has worked extensively with tribes, tribal organizations, land trusts, and prescribed burn associations to help implement beneficial fire projects and advance beneficial fire policy at the state and federal level. She serves as co-lead of the Stewardship Project, a federal policy and advocacy group that brings together Indigenous practitioners and Western scientists. Ms. Clark is the lead author of the Good Fire Reports for the Karuk tribe and served as a subject matter expert on issues related to cultural burning and tribal sovereignty in the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. She also serves as the chair of the board of directors for Save the Redwoods League. Jenna Archer has worked with land trusts, tribal organizations, and local and state government entities to further her client's work in land conservation and stewardship. Her practice areas include land trust and conservation law and beneficial fire policy. Ms. Archer has also worked with the Stewardship Project to develop federal policy recommendations to promote the use of beneficial fire, including prescribed fire, Indigenous cultural burning, and wildfire managed for resource benefit. Now, please join me in welcoming Sarah Clark and Jenna Archer.
Thanks so much, Autumn. I really appreciate that introduction. Jenna, if you could please swap it to the next slide. So as Autumn went through, these are some of our bios here. I won't go through those again, but I did want to spend a little bit of time introducing you further to the Stewardship Project. So the Stewardship Project was conceived as a partnership by Scott Stevens, who runs the Fire Lab at UC Berkeley. I understand that we may have a number of participants from the Fire Lab today. And Don Hankins, who is a Plains Miwok fire practitioner and a professor at Chico. And the two of them came up with an idea to bring together Western scientists working in fire ecology, as well as Indigenous practitioners interested in the promotion of stewardship activities across the landscape, and to see how those two groups of people might have mutual interests in the promotion of federal wildland fire policy. And the idea was that wildland fire policy has been kind of stuck for a long time. We've had a number of ideas come up in the federal space, but not a lot of movement. And the idea of bringing together these kind of disparate groups to focus on fire policy was to see if we could get additional movement and kind of new ideas presented on the Hill. And so we've been operating for the last 2.5 years. And have brought together folks from all of the Western states to formulate policy ideas and to advance those on Capitol Hill with lawmakers and with administration officials. And we've had a pretty good reception. One of the things that I'll note is that a lot of the issues we talk about have a good bipartisan basis. I think in the space that we're talking about today, there is some people approach it from different angles, and we can certainly answer questions about that if you have any, but it's been nice to have a foray that folks on both sides of the aisle really seem to care about. And so the other thing that we have done through the stewardship project is work on a series of papers on our core topic areas. When you bring together a bunch of academics, that's what they want to do. And so we've been tasked with helping to write a number of these papers. And the one that we're talking about today really takes a legal look at some of the questions around the use of beneficial fire, and in particular, how environmental regulations either promote or impede the use of beneficial fire on the landscape. And so it's been a really interesting project for Jenna and I to work on. The paper was published over the summer in Fire Ecology as part of a whole series on Indigenous stewardship. I'll talk at the end about another one of the papers that is there as well that relates to this topic. But just note that that's a resource and a place where we're trying to get some of the good policy work out into the world. So with that, if you could switch the slide, Jenna. So I wanted to start with some of the framing as to kind of why we wanted to tackle this particular issue in greater depth. And I will first start with a definition. I've used the term beneficial fire. We use it in our paper quite a bit. And just to start with a statement of what we mean by that, that includes both prescribed fire, which is typically done by federal agencies or state agencies, and it's done under sort of a Western science and legal framework. We then have cultural burning, which is done by Indigenous peoples according to their knowledge, practice, and belief systems and tribal laws. And then the third category that falls into beneficial fire is wildfire managed for resource benefit, the idea of using unintentional ignitions to get good work done on the landscape. And so those three types of fire management all fall under the heading of beneficial fire. And in particular, for our paper, we really focused on the first two, so prescribed fire and cultural burning, with some discussion of managed wildfire. So why are we talking about this at all? Why is beneficial fire important? And why has it been a focus of our work? So as we know, California and Western states are facing a wildfire crisis. We can measure this crisis across a number of different parameters. We have had some of the largest fires on record. The August complex fire in 2020 exceeded 1 million acres. That's the 8th largest fire in the US history. We've had some of the highest fatalities on record, unfortunately. Certainly the Camp Fire in Paradise was one of those markers for folks living in California. And I'll note that these official fatality numbers don't take into account the health impacts from wildfire smoke, which research has shown has a really devastating effect on cardiovascular and pulmonary acute events and can lead towards a number of heart attacks and strokes and other impacts right after the smoke exposure. We also see a wildfire crisis in terms of cost. I think we all saw a wake up on that with the LA fires this past month. And those are projected to exceed $32 billion at this point in insured losses. But we've had others that have exceeded the $10 billion mark as well. The Camp Fire and Tubbs Fire both did. And so we know that California is in a wildfire crisis, and there has been much discussion, particularly over the last 6 weeks, about those underlying causes. Before we get into talking about the regulatory impacts, I really want to make clear that I think from our perspective, the causes of the wildfire crisis are multifaceted. We are not here to say that NEPA and the Endangered Species Act are the reason we have a wildfire crisis, or even a large reason why we have a wildfire crisis. Those causes are intertwined and relate to a number of different facets. The location of housing and infrastructure, climate change, especially when we have low moisture and high winds, and this new identification of kind of climate boomerangs, or these very high water years followed by very severe drought years, which I believe is another topic for a seminar that you're going to be hearing about later in the series. We see the wildfire crisis caused in part by lack of home hardening and defensible space. We have concerns about the specific suppression tactics that are used and whether or not we have enough resources to fight fires. But then the last reason that gets brought up, and it is applicable in some areas more so than others, is concerns about fuel buildup and lack of forest resilience. I want to be clear that this is not necessarily a significant problem across all areas. There was a lot of communication after the LA fires about how we need to do more forest thinning, and that's probably not at the end of the investigations and not going to be a root cause of those fires. But in much of the state and in much of the West, fuel buildup on forested and other wildland ecosystems is at least one part of the reason why we have a wildfire crisis. And the impacts from these wildfires can be devastating, certainly across the metrics that I talked about at the beginning, but also across ecological impacts. So we see impacts to watersheds from erosion, debris flow, loss of water storage, species lost, forest conversion, loss of carbon sequestration. These are all damaging impacts from wildfires that affect our wildlands and wild spaces. And in those areas, we know from empirical research that there's many barriers to getting the effective stewardship work done. By stewardship work, in this context, we're particularly talking about that beneficial fire, but stewardship can also include use of other types of thinning and other hand treatments, mechanical treatments, et cetera. And to the barriers to getting those done are also multifaceted. There is no silver bullet to say that if we change this one thing, all of a sudden we would be able to do the work that we know needs to be done. We have problems related to the workforce, to funding, land access, public opposition, lack of capacity in tribal partners, and lack of support for tribal laws. But one that is frequently identified and that we'll focus on today is environmental compliance and the barriers that are created by our host of environmental laws that sort of form the underpinning of how we address environmental impacts and risk at a federal level. So given that, we wanted to explore how our environmental laws actually look at fire because we see this as this potential barrier, we wanted to understand what aspect is causing this barrier. How are these laws framed? How are they implemented? And what are the things that could potentially be done to address some of these barriers in a way that doesn't cause an erosion of the purposes of these laws and their underpinnings? So we have looked at this from an approach that fire is part of the natural landscape. And I think that's the theme that Jenna and I will come back to over and over again when we look at the evaluation of these laws. And I want to take a quick detour into a conversation about what I mean by natural, because that can get us tripped up. It gets us tripped up all the time when we're writing about it. And I just want to be very clear that the word natural can have implications that imply that people are not part of the ecosystem and that things that are natural are places where humans are apart from those ecosystems. This gets really complicated in a place like California, where people have been part of our ecosystem since time immemorial. And so when we use the term natural, we try not to, but if we slip up into it, and if we are looking at the ways the laws refer to it, we believe that natural encompasses those sort of traditional practices because they are part of how our ecosystems have evolved. So now I will get to the point of this slide and this particular graphic. So when we started looking at the four major environmental laws that we'll talk about today, they all were passed right around this end of the 1960s, early 1970s. And one thing that I think is interesting to point out, this is a graph of climate and wildfire area burned in the Western states. It's an analysis of the 11 Western states done in 2009. One thing to note on this is there's been some bad data in this, but this is from a paper that looked at trying to address some of those underlying data issues, particularly from fires between the 1920s and 1940s, to make sure that we were doing a good apples to apples comparison. But what you'll see is this is largely U-shaped. So we used to burn a lot of areas. And in fact, in California, we have a fire history that indicates that the state on average used to burn at least 4.5 million acres per year. Sometimes some projections show up to 12 acres. Much of that was done by Indigenous people, but there were also fires that were started and potentially started from lightning and then potentially managed. And even when we started to see the significant impacts of Western culture and manifest destiny and colonization, et cetera, we still continued to see pretty high fire numbers, in part because we didn't have the suppression workforce and tactics that we do now. But by the 1950s, we see that those numbers really start to decline. And I think it's notable that when our environmental laws were passed, which is where this red arrow is roughly located, we were basically at our lowest level of burning in the Western states. And so Congress, I think it is fair to assume, and based on the relevant statutory history and the text of the laws, did not take fire into account when these laws were passed, and didn't really consider how should the Endangered Species Act work in fire adapted ecosystems. How do we think about the role that humans have long played in managing and shaping these ecosystems. And so we are now seeing the upswing of fire, and we're faced with laws that don't give us clear direction on how fire should be appropriately incorporated. So with that kind of big framing, we wanted to turn to going through each of the 4 laws and walking a little bit in detail about how they work and how fire is or is not taken into account within them. And what I think the overarching theme we want to leave with is that our analysis indicates that these laws kind of are based on the assumption that fire would remain at those 1970s level and is something that we could ultimately control and regulate our way out of the potential bad effects of. And I think what we've seen over the last, certainly the last 10 to 15 years, is that assumption is incorrect, and we need to start rethinking about how our structures actually support the work that we want to do. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jenna, who is going to walk us through the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA. She'll do that one and the Clean Air Act, and then we'll come back to me to talk about the Endangered Species Act and the Wilderness Act. So Jenna, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for setting up that framing. I'll kick this off talking a little bit about the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA. So the purpose of NEPA is ultimately to ensure that federal agencies look before they leap into major decisions. It is meant to promote transparency and accountability about federal decision-making, including not only analysis within the agency, but also an opportunity for the public to comment on major actions. So this law requires that federal agencies evaluate environmental impacts of proposed actions, as well as alternatives to those actions, before committing to any major federal action that could have a significant impact on the environment. Agencies go through 3 tiers of analysis during NEPA compliance. First is evaluating whether a categorical exclusion applies to an action, which basically there are certain types of actions that are designated as not needing NEPA review across the board. If the agency finds that there is no applicable categorical exclusion, it moves on to conduct an environmental assessment, which is a short study to evaluate if the action would have a significant impact. If the agency does find that to be the case, it then moves on to an environmental impact statement, also referred to as an EIS. And this is a comprehensive study of, again, the action, the proposed alternatives to the action, including the no action alternative. So looking at what would happen if the project did not go forward whatsoever. And these reports can be hundreds of pages. They are quite hefty. And as I noted, this includes a public comment period. So the agency will first release a draft EIS. It will move on to a public comment period where the public has the opportunity to submit concerns and comments about the draft. Then the agency is tasked with replying to those public comments and also issuing a final EIS. So federal agencies interpret NEPA to apply to implementing beneficial fire, despite the fact that, as Sarah noted, it does not seem that legislators had fire in mind when they passed this statute. And the text of NEPA does not specifically discuss this issue. So in theory, an agency could make a determination that NEPA did not apply to this type of action, but that is not how agencies approach the issue. So Some categorical exclusions do apply to certain fuel reduction projects. For example, the Department of the Interior has created a categorical exclusion for certain hazardous fuel reduction projects under a certain acreage. And similarly, the Forest Service has a few categorical exclusions that apply to prescribed burns only in limited circumstances, including when they are under a certain size. So how does this impact implementation of beneficial fire projects? We found that NEPA can pose a barrier to getting beneficial fire on the ground for a few reasons. First, NEPA can cause delay in projects. For smaller projects, NEPA review can be conducted pretty quickly in about under 6 months. But for larger scale process, NEPA review can take several years. So specifically, a white paper recently found that on average, when a categorical exclusion applied, NEPA review took 193 days on average. But when the full environmental impact statement and public comment period was required, NEPA review took over 1,000 days on average to complete. So in addition, NEPA review can open up a project to litigation. If an agency finds that a categorical exclusion applies, an organization or member of the public could come in and sue the agency on the basis that they improperly applied a categorical exclusion. If the agency does conduct the full EIS process, someone could come in and sue on the basis that that review was not adequate and was not conducted in accordance with the law. Also, because these reviews are so extensive, they're very time intensive, it requires agencies to dedicate a lot of staff and time and resources to NEPA review. So with that in mind, one way to address the delay that NEPA can pose to getting fire on the ground would be to increase the number of well-trained staff and the funding and the resources that we dedicate to NEPA review. But unfortunately, that has not what has been going on recently, and given the current political atmosphere, we don't view this as a viable political solution to this issue at this time. So this ultimately can create a barrier to proactive stewardship because NEPA can cause a delay in getting these projects on the ground, getting fire on the ground. During that period, emergencies occur, including severe wildfires. And when an agency is acting in an emergency response, this does not require NEPA review. It does not go through analysis and a public comment process. And instead, the agency can go through what are called alternative arrangements, consulting with the Federal Council for Environmental Quality, which oversees NEPA implementation. Because these emergency responses pose less of an administrative barrier on agencies compared to proactive management, this undercuts the purpose of the statute when these responses are not going through NEPA review. Because again, the purposes of this statute include accountability, requiring that agencies go through planning and public input, reasoned analysis. So really, we believe that this is flipping the way that agencies are responding to fires. And when we zoom out to a broader policy perspective on this, as Sarah mentioned earlier, NEPA is structurally and conceptually an ill fit for beneficial fire because it does treat beneficial fire as a federal action, as opposed to a part of normal ecosystem processes. And in fire-dependent and fire-adapted ecosystems, those ecosystems co-evolved with fire. So NEPA looks at beneficial fire as external to those ecosystems, whereas really fire on a recurring basis is part of how our landscapes function. So that's NEPA. And to move on to the second environmental statute that we really did a deep dive in is the Clean Air Act, which is another landmark federal statute that has had a major impact on air quality nationwide. And I should say both the Clean Air Act and NEPA were passed in 1970. So as Sarah pointed out, during this period of time when burning was at effectively an all-time low. And so legislators didn't really have this top of mind when they were designing this statute. So the Clean Air Act has a significantly different structure than NEPA. And in the Clean Air Act, both the federal government and state governments play a role. So first, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, establishes what are called National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, which set certain levels of particulate matter and ozone that are effectively acceptable for there to be in the air. So the NAAQS regulate what are called criteria pollutants, including pollutants that we see as emissions of fire, and that is both wildfire as well as beneficial fire. So once EPA has established those standards, states are then tasked with meeting those standards through creating state implementation plans, which basically lay out the actions that the states are going to take to get into attainment with those standards. Then we flip back to the EPA, which evaluates whether states are in either attainment or non-attainment of those standards. And when states do not get into attainment, they can be faced with regulatory consequences, including loss of federal highway funds, for one, which is a pretty big stick. And so it's important to note that ambient air quality standards are about ambient air quality. So the Clean Air Act is indifferent to the source of the pollution. As far as attainment of the NAAQS is concerned, it does not matter if those emissions are coming from an industrial facility or motor vehicles or wildfires or beneficial fire. There is one caveat to this, which is the exceptional events rule. And this is a rule within the Clean Air Act that allows agencies to account for the specific source of the emissions under limited circumstances. So under the exceptional events rule, certain emissions data can be excluded from the EPA's review of whether an area is in attainment with the NAAQS, where the emissions came from an exceptional event. Exceptional events can include high wind dust events, wildfires, and in theory, beneficial fire, though, as I'll talk about shortly, that hasn't really played out in practice. To qualify as an exceptional event, events have to meet certain criteria, including that it affected the air quality, was not reasonably controllable or preventable, and was caused by either a natural event or by a human activity unlikely to occur at a particular location. So right away, I think we can see that this language is ill-suited for beneficial fire in a number of ways. First, there's this idea that it has to be a human activity unlikely to occur at a particular location. But for beneficial fire, we want these fires to be reoccurring, because for a beneficial fire to effectively serve its purpose, to be an effective tool, it has to occur periodically. And similarly, the exceptional event rule requires an event to be not reasonably controllable or preventable. But controlled burn is a synonym for prescribed fire. So really, the language is not a good fit. However, it is a very good thing that the EPA has kind of shoehorned beneficial fire into the exceptional events rule, because otherwise there would not be any mechanism in the Clean Air Act for taking emissions from what we know to be, a great tool to reduce wildfire risk and severity overall, and exclude that data from evaluation of whether a state is meeting its obligations under the Clean Air Act. So zooming back out more broadly to the exceptional events rule, in order for the EPA to exclude data under that rule, the air agency has to make what's called an exceptional events demonstration. And these are extensive technical analyses of the event and its impacts on air quality, like NEPA review, these can be hundreds of pages. These reviews can be hard to do, especially for beneficial fires. They are costly, they are time consuming, and they require extensive technical analysis. So the exceptional events rule was most recently updated by the EPA in 2016. And like I mentioned earlier, the EPA really did intend to have this apply to beneficial fire. And the intention there was to make it easier for air agencies to do an exceptional events demonstration for beneficial fire. Unfortunately, this has not really worked out in practice. So what are the Clean Air Act's impacts on beneficial fire? The structure of the Clean Air Act and also the exceptional events rule can serve as a perverse incentive that actually disincentivizes proactive stewardship. Because beneficial fires do cause emissions, it can be easier for states to disallow beneficial fires in the first place, kind of looking at it from that short-term perspective in order to avoid emissions that could potentially impact attainment status and might result in the air agency needing to do an exceptional events demonstration. So instead of engaging in that proactive stewardship and implementing beneficial fire projects, there is an incentive to instead take no action. And when wildfires do occur, because we know that without proactive stewardship, wildfire risk and severity is higher. If that occurs down the line, then the agency can be reactive and do an exceptional events demonstration, rather than being proactive to get ahead of the issue. And as I touched on earlier, the exceptional events rule was meant to address this issue, particularly the 2016 amendments that really were intended to streamline this for beneficial fire projects. But we unfortunately have not seen that play out in practice. We know that there is just one exceptional events demonstration that has been completed for a beneficial fire project. And this was in Placer County. And it took the EPA and Forest Service staff working on this project months to complete, for only 1 day of prescribed burning. And again, like with NEPA, if we really just zoom out to the broader structure and just kind of conceptual understanding of fire and the role of fire in ecosystems, it's just not a great fit for what we know now to be the role of fire in fire-adapted and fire-dependent landscapes. And in those landscapes, beneficial or periodic low-intensity fires is a normal ecosystem process. It's part of having healthy environments. And those fires have always and will always result in emissions. And the Clean Air Act does not treat those as part of ultimately healthy landscapes. And now I will pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Jenna. Okay, so I'm going to talk next about the Endangered Species Act, or ESA. So the Endangered Species Act was also passed in this roughly the same time frame. This one came about in 1973. And the purpose of it was to ensure the conservation of ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species depend. But the work of the Endangered Species Act, the permitting and the regulatory apparatus around it tends to be species specific. And that's based on the plants and animal species that have been listed as threatened and endangered under the listing provisions. Once those species are listed, then the ESA requires kind of a two-pronged analysis to understand how potential activities could have impacts on those listed species. For federal agencies, it requires an evaluation of the effects of federal actions on species, including actions that directly or indirectly cause modifications to land or water. As you can see, prescribed fire, beneficial fire falls into that category. There's also the second prong of ESA compliance, which requires evaluation and permitting for similar actions on private lands. Endangered Species Act, unlike NEPA, applies to both those directly to private actions. So what's the process that's required? For this federal agency action, it imposes a consultation obligation where federal agencies, if they're doing something that, again, has this potential to directly or indirectly cause modifications to land, they must consult with either the National Marine Fisheries Service, NIMFS, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, depending on the species at issue. And if the species is present in the area where the project is happening, and if the species is likely adversely affected, then you have to engage in a next step process called formal consultation and the development of a biological opinion that basically shows that mitigation measures have been taken into account to prevent those adverse impacts. And indeed, if the agencies determine that the action would jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered species or threatened species, or result in the destruction or adverse modification of their habitat, then the agencies are required to go through an effort to develop reasonably prudent alternatives. So that's the permitting process on the, or the analysis process on the federal agency action. But there's a similar process for private actions through an incidental take permit requirement. Any take of endangered or threatened species is incidental to, and not to, sorry, any take is defined as this harm or interference or bothering of a threatened or endangered species to, where that effect is incidental to and not the purpose of the otherwise lawful activity. So essentially, if you're doing something that's otherwise allowed and you inadvertently or indirectly harm endangered or threatened species, then you're required to apply for an incidental take permit and have imposed mitigation measures that minimize and mitigate those impacts to the species. So these are the two routes for ESA compliance. And as I noted up at top, they're very focused on impacts to individual threatened and endangered species compliance. So one of the main problems that gets identified with ESA compliance, just like NEPA, just like some of the Clean Air Act exceptional events demonstrations, is delay. So even if you are just going through that informal process to determine that even though you're causing modifications to land or water, there's not likely to be an adverse effect, even that informal consultation process, reaching out to the agencies and getting them to concur, can take up to a year, with the average consultation process taking at least 90 days. And so that amount of time has significant impacts. What we've seen, and with what the Stewardship Project group has noted, is we are aware of a number of planned stewardship activities and beneficial fire projects where, while waiting for permitting to be completed, catastrophic fire came, and all of the good things that the entities were trying to do with their beneficial fire projects were completely dwarfed by the impacts of wildland fire. And so even though those delays seem short, they have these impacts when we are facing this kind of crisis situation and our time to do good work is short. But the ESA also has other adverse effects on beneficial fire through the imposition of mitigation measures that actually prevent the underlying work from getting done. So one of the things that occasionally comes up is the imposition of things like limited operating periods, which are times of year that you can't do beneficial fire because there might be impacts on nesting birds or other species. And while those are intended to be protective and indeed may need to be protective, at the end of the day, they're preventing some of the work from getting done at times of year where it's otherwise appropriate for the ecosystem to be receiving fire. And so by taking this sort of species-specific approach, we're not doing the work that is beneficial for the ecosystem as a whole and that ultimately supports the habitat that individual species need to rely on. And this is really the bigger structural problem that we see with ESA compliance, is that it focuses on impacts to these individual species and critters, as opposed to looking at ways to be supportive of fire use as the necessary component of fire-adapted and fire-dependent ecosystems. And so a more honest realignment of ESA would recognize that fire is part of these ecosystems and that application of fire to them is not the type of federal agency action or private action that needs to be studied with the same level of rigor as when we're doing things to ecosystems that are not part of their, quote, natural background. And so that is the misalignment that we see between Endangered Species Act and the use of beneficial fire. Next, I'm going to turn briefly to the Wilderness Act, and I'm going to couch this as just a little bit of a teaser because I know that you are also going to be hearing later this seminar series from Claire Boehringer, who is the author of a paper called Untrammeling the Wilderness, Restoring Natural Conditions to the Return of Human-Ignited Fire. This is part of our Fire Ecology Indigenous Stewardship series, and one of the co-authors on this paper is Don Hinkins, who is one of the co-leads of the Stewardship Project. We wanted to bring it up today because I think it fits really nicely with the suite of conversations that we're having about the ways that our environmental policies don't appropriately look at the role of fire on the landscape. So the Wilderness Act passed a little bit earlier in 1964, but still in that window of low fire on the ground. It established the National Wilderness Preservation System and mandated that these designated landscapes be protected from development and preserved in their natural conditions for future generations. Today, we have over 111 million acres of wilderness areas. Most of them about half of them are in Alaska. And there are over 800 unique wilderness areas. They're administered by a suite of federal agencies: National Park Service, Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and BLM. And there are some wilderness areas that are open to co-stewardship and co-management arrangements with tribes. I think it is fun, interesting to look back at the Wilderness Act statutory language. I just cannot imagine this type of language ever passing Congress now. So it's fun to look at, but I also think raises a number of questions. So here, wilderness areas are defined as an area where the earth and its community of life are, quote, untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain, and an area of undeveloped federal land retaining its, quote, primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation. And within this area, the federal agencies are directed to ensure that they generally appear to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticed. And so with that definition, federal agencies are then directed to protect and manage those areas so as to preserve their natural conditions. Again, raising that issue about what natural means. Federal agencies that interpret this act have interpreted these requirements to mean that both the suppression of fire and the ignition of fire are, quote, trammeling actions, meaning that they're modern human manipulations of the landscape that allegedly degrade wilderness character. This has had a really significant impact, particularly on the use of beneficial fire in wilderness areas. I'll note that even though arguably suppression tactics should not be used in wilderness areas either due to this, that doesn't always occur, and emergencies tend to take priority, or perceived emergencies tend to take priority. And so what the Wilderness Act really does then is it continues this bifurcation of setting fire use as something that is apart from natural ecosystems and something that is separate from them, when in fact, what this whole activity is in trying to get us to think about is that human use of fire is part of our natural ecosystems, and that our ecosystems have evolved with that use since time immemorial. And if we pretend that it is part of if we instead believe that wilderness is something that man is apart from, we end up seeing the impacts that we have from the wildfire crisis. And so we believe that sort of this reconceptualization of these frameworks that recognizes the longstanding role that Indigenous people have played in shaping these landscapes will help us to ensure that we all have a role to play in keeping them healthy and resilient into the future. So with that, I'm going to pause and see what kinds of questions we have.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Jenna. So now we'll open it up for questions. Feel free to put your questions into the Q&A chat. Due to the time constraints and high attendance, we kindly ask that you keep all questions in the chat. And with that, I'll get started. So we have a question in here about NEPA. Is NEPA endangered given the new administration?
Oh, goodness, that's a whole other separate seminar. I will do my best to provide kind of a current overlay of where things stand. So even before the Trump administration came into power in January, we had seen some significant threats to NEPA. And actually, before I even start there, I want to note that I think Jenna and I and the Stewardship Project take a pretty nuanced view on these environmental laws. I want to make really clear that we are strong supporters of the underlying purpose of NEPA, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, et cetera. And I don't believe that everyone in this policy space is aligned on that and would rather see these laws sort of torn down. It puts us in an interesting position because we have this alignment on certain issues and really see the impacts that these laws are having on the work that we want to get done, but also don't want to see them completely destroyed. So with that caveat, what I'll say is in December, end of November, there was a DC Court of Appeals decision called Marin Audubon Society versus National Park Service that held that all of the NEPA regulations, so these are the laws that are passed by the Council on Environmental Quality to help implement the statute that Congress passed. The court held that those were, quote, ultra vires, which means without authority to issue them. And this has really called into question many of the tenets of NEPA that Jenna talked about. It's always awkward having these talks when so much is changing, because I think that you should know that the talk that we just gave assumes that our systems of government are still working the way we all assume them to be. I don't know if we're in that world anymore, to be quite honest. And I have a great deal of concern that NEPA is gravely threatened by both this administration and by the courts, and that we are continuing to see the rollback of the administrative state, which has frankly been the goal of the Republican Party for the last 30 years, and we're seeing it come to pass. So I don't want to be too Pollyanna about what is happening.
Okay, and then we have two questions that I think are kind of related, but one is, what are the swiftest actions we can take to remedy these misalignments? And another one is, are there any policies or packages at the Fed level that those who want more beneficial fire can advocate for?
Yeah, so Jenna, do you want to talk just a little bit about some of the, in particular, like the NEPA ideas about what agencies could do without regulatory change?
Sure. Yeah, one of the approaches that agencies could take is that, again, NEPA, the statutory language, does not specifically state that beneficial fire is one of these federal actions that the act is intended to cover. So agencies have a lot of authority in how they implement laws. So these federal systems are structured so that Congress passes a statute, and then federal agencies, which are part of the executive branch, come in and pass regulations that kind of get more into the nitty-gritty. You know, we can't expect Congress and the language that they pass in a statute to anticipate every single circumstance in which this law is going to be applied. So when that gets to the federal agencies who are implementing these statutes, they adopt their own regulations on how they are going to apply these on the ground. I mentioned earlier that the Department of the Interior, for example, has passed regulations about categorical exclusions. Similarly, the Forest Service has taken actions through their regulatory authority, so not requiring any action via statutes. And similarly, kind of even below that regulatory rulemaking process, you know, every day agencies are making decisions on how they interpret those, how they implement those on the ground. So we have, you know, actors in the federal government every day making decisions on how they interpret those. And so we do think that there is space in that statutory language, and there is space within those regulations for agencies to be more proactive and about moving forward with these projects, as opposed to, placing them in this broader context where they're going through a really stringent review. Sarah, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, and I'll just say it really requires some creative thinking and, sort of willingness to play along by the federal line officers, and that doesn't always happen. But there's the Western Klamath Regional Partnership, which I'm just plugging all your later seminars, but I know you're having folks from the Klamath come and talk in the next seminar. They've done some pretty creative NEPA work on an environmental assessment document that starts to talk about fire in this kind of different way. And so I think the swiftest way of getting things done is to work at a local level, especially these days, and really try and prioritize getting good work done and being creative about how you apply a number of these laws. There's other ones that will require statutory change. What I'll say about kind of where things are right now is the big bill that is in play is called the Fix Our Forests Act, or FOFA. And it passed out of the House 2 weeks ago, January 28th. On a bipartisan basis. It was a Republican-led bill by the only registered professional forester in Congress, Congressman Westerman from Arkansas. But 64 Democrats also voted for it. The bill is trying to get at regulatory reform by focusing on providing some streamlining activities within fireshed areas. Within those fireshed areas, which are sort of designated high-risk areas from a wildfire perspective, there are a suite of management activities that are identified for sort of streamlined treatment under NEPA and the Endangered Species Act. We have some concerns that the streamlining provisions are very broad at the moment and would include things like chemical treatment and potentially clear cutting and other things that we think kind of are not appropriate for wildfire risk reduction. And so we're working with coalitions to try and get those tightened up over on the Senate side. But that's the biggest bill in play. And if you're interested, I would say that engaging on the Senate side on FOFA is probably the most effective place to be involved in wildfire policy right now. And then the other thing that I was just going to say is, the concepts that we talked about today, one of the reasons why Jenna and I were really interested in writing this paper is that environmental organizations, traditional NGOs, I think are rightfully concerned about kind of slippery slope arguments that once you start to provide streamlining for one thing, it opens up the act to being sort of eviscerated. And I think there's a way of this conception that we've been talking about of really treating fire differently, right? It is different because of this role that it has played in the landscape for, since time immemorial. And so because of that, we think it can be cabined nicely. And so that's part of the way we've been advocating for it with congressional folks.
Thank you. And then we have a question about CEQA. So have you or any other group done an analysis of the operation of CEQA with respect to wildfire safety similar to your analysis of NEPA, especially including CEQA weaponization, legal actions to prevent public park/wildland non-burning fuels mitigation adjacent to and within highly populated areas?
Yeah, so we haven't done a paper of that, but both Jenna and I and our firm are pretty heavily involved in the CEQA side of things as well as California environmental attorneys. And I would say that a lot of the similar concepts that we talked about, I think, are applicable in CEQA as well. CEQA refers to the idea of baseline conditions. That is the thing that you're supposed to establish what baseline conditions are and then evaluate a project's change from the baseline under CEQA analysis. And I think that there's a potential way of doing that CEQA analysis where you say that fire use is part of the baseline, and therefore putting fire on the ground doesn't change the baseline and therefore doesn't require any further analysis because it's just baked in as part of what the landscape is built to accept. Sounds like this question is getting at some of the broader uses of broader fuel treatment issues where you start talking about use of mechanical treatments or chemical treatments in the landscape. Certainly those can play a role, or people believe they can play a role in addressing the wildfire crisis. And I think the analysis that we've done is less applicable to those areas. I'll note that the state has been working quite a bit on CEQA exemptions to try and facilitate the use of or the implementation of wildfire risk reduction issues. They did a whole thing called the CalVTP, California Vegetation Treatment Programmatic Environmental Impact Report, that was issued 5 years ago that is supposed to streamline the process. Again, could be a whole other webinar to talk about the ways in which that has not yet really come to pass, but the state is trying to work on the issues that are raised by this question.
Okay, we have a few good questions still in the chat. Do you guys mind answering one more?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So are state level protections for special status species more critical than ever as ESA is under attack? What research, outreach, advocacy is lacking for helping to galvanize the state law to maximize conservation and minimize or effectively mitigate cumulative impacts? Do we need to get super friendly with our favorite environmental lawyer to do basic research?
Yeah, so I would say that state law, let me take it, I'm going to pull back a little bit from just that focus on special status species. State law is going to be more important and critical in this space than ever. I think that's true for, as we talked about the federal laws, NEPA, the Clean Air Act, Federal Endangered Species Act. Those all have state counterparts. So we have CEQA, we have state air quality laws, and we have CISA, the California Endangered Species Act. And those all, in many cases, are more stringent than their federal counterparts. So even if the federal laws go away, we still have state laws. The issue is what projects they apply to. So it's not that federal laws and state laws always apply to all projects. Instead, it's really about who the actor is. And so what you run into difficulties on is, like, can you impose regulations that come from CEQA or CISA onto federal actions? Generally speaking, no. And so they're really important. They're critical to making sure that we protect human health, the environment, endangered species, et cetera. I think they still need to have modification to account for some of the stuff we were talking about today. But they're not going to be the bulwark. They can't be the bulwark against everything that the federal government is doing, unfortunately.
Okay, so as we wrap up today's session, I want to thank you all for joining us. A special thanks to Sarah Clark and Jenna Archer for their enlightening presentation. Our next session is scheduled for February 18th, where we'll be discussing changing the fire paradigm in the Klamath Mountains with Bill Tripp. Before we sign off, please keep an eye out for the webinar evaluation that will be sent out soon. Thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing you all in our future sessions. Have a great day. And Sarah and Jenna, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.